There is a man in the Old Testament who is said to have commanded the weather. He announced a drought, and the sky closed. He called fire down from heaven. He restored breath to a child who had stopped moving. And when his story reached its final scene, he did not grow old, die, and enter a grave like other human beings. A chariot of fire appeared, a whirlwind rose, and Elijah vanished into the sky. If you were raised inside a religious tradition, you may have heard these stories so many times that they no longer sound strange. They arrive already interpreted. Before you can ask what they mean, you are told what they prove. Before you can examine them, they have already been placed in the protected category of miracle. But familiarity is not evidence. Sometimes familiarity is simply repetition that has become invisible. If you did not grow up hearing these stories, you may have an advantage. You can encounter them before habit tells you how you are supposed to react. You can listen to the claims as claims. You can ask what kind of evidence supports them, what kind of world produced them, and what their authors wanted their audiences to believe. The biblical narrative presents 8 extraordinary episodes around Elijah. Taken together, they form the public image of one of the most dramatic prophets in the Hebrew Bible. So I went through them, one by one. I looked at the language. I looked at the historical setting. I looked at the physical evidence archaeologists have found, and at the evidence they have not found. I compared these stories with the religious traditions surrounding ancient Israel, especially the stories that were already circulating before the books of Kings reached their written form. What emerged was not merely a list of doubtful claims. It was a pattern. Once that pattern becomes visible, the miracles begin to look less like interruptions of nature and more like human constructions shaped by language, politics, memory, and religious competition. Not random inventions, necessarily. Not meaningless tales, but stories built for purposes that become clearer when we stop asking only, could this have happened? And begin asking, why did this story need to be told this way? Oddly enough, the most revealing episode is not the fire or the chariot. Those are so spectacular that they almost announce themselves as literature. The detail that first disturbed my certainty was much smaller. A single Hebrew word. Depending on how its vowels are supplied, it may describe miraculous birds feeding a prophet or ordinary people supplying a fugitive. One word. One inherited pronunciation. Nearly 2,000 years of sermons. We will come to it soon. Before we do, there is something else you should know. One item in this celebrated sequence is not really a miracle at all. It is a body count. 450 people are killed, and the narrative presents their deaths as part of a divine victory. More disturbing still, the killing occurs immediately after the most famous miracle in Elijah's life. The heavenly fire and the human slaughter are not separate stories. They belong to the same afternoon, the same contest, the same chapter. Yet one half is celebrated in children's lessons while the other is often passed over in a sentence. That separation matters. It prevents us from seeing the moral structure of the whole scene. But the story does not begin with fire. It begins with weather. At the opening of 1 Kings 17, Elijah confronts King Ahab and declares that there will be neither dew nor rain except by his word. The land then enters a prolonged drought. Years later, after the confrontation on Mount Carmel, Elijah prays again. Clouds gather, and rain returns. That is the first miracle as the tradition usually presents it. The prophet closes the sky and later opens it. But to understand what the story is doing, we have to remember whom Yahweh was competing against in the narrative. A large part of the population was drawn toward Baal, the deity promoted by Queen Jezebel and worshipped throughout the wider Canaanite and Phoenician world. Baal was not simply a generic foreign god. Texts discovered at Ugarit describe him as a deity of storms, thunder, rain, and agricultural fertility. One of his titles was Rider of the Clouds. Rain was not a minor part of Baal's identity. Rain was the center of his authority. Crops, animals, hunger, survival. Everything depended on the seasonal return of water. To worship Baal was, among other things, to appeal to the power believed to govern the storm. Now read Elijah's declaration again. The narrative is not merely saying that Yahweh can produce unusual weather. It is attacking Baal at the exact point where Baal is supposed to be strongest. The rain god cannot produce rain. Yahweh can withhold it for years and restore it at will. The drought becomes a theological argument aimed directly at a rival religion. that does not make the drought supernatural. The eastern Mediterranean and the Levant experienced recurring periods of severe dryness. Environmental evidence, sediment, pollen records, geological studies, and shifts in ancient settlement patterns shows that droughts lasting several years were part of the region's climate. A 2-year, 3-year, or even longer drought in Iron Age Israel would have been devastating, but it would not have violated the order of nature. The more plausible sequence is painfully ordinary. A real drought occurred. It scarred communities deeply enough to remain in cultural memory. Later storytellers connected that remembered catastrophe to Elijah and turned climate into religious proof. What nature produced through causes became, on the page, a weapon in a contest between gods. This is where a Spinoza-inspired reading becomes useful. For Spinoza, nature does not suspend its order to advertise one community's theology. Events arise from causes, even when those causes are hidden from us. Calling an event a miracle often reveals less about the event than about the limits of the observer's understanding. When people do not know why the rain stopped, imagination supplies intention. When the rain returns, gratitude can be transformed into confirmation. And once a natural event is given a moral narrator, the drought acquires a message it never contained by itself. The timing of the returning rain is therefore crucial. It falls only after the prophets of Baal have been killed. Blood is shed, then the sky opens. That sequence is not decorative. It is narrative architecture. The rain functions as a reward, as though the restored water confirms that the violence was justified. For now, keep that connection in mind. Drought, religious rivalry, massacre, rain. During those dry years, Elijah hides near the brook Cherith, and there, in the solitude of the wilderness, we encounter the small miracle that begins to expose the machinery beneath all the others. According to 1 Kings 17, God commands the orvim to bring Elijah bread and meat in the morning and again in the evening. Orvim. Most English Bibles translate the word as ravens. The familiar picture is almost cinematic. Black scavenger birds flying through the wilderness, each carrying food to a hunted prophet beside a shrinking stream. It is memorable. It is visually perfect for a sermon. And because it arrives inside Scripture, many readers accept it before they ever ask how the Hebrew word came to mean what their translation says it means. Ancient Hebrew was originally written primarily with consonants. The vowel points that guide later pronunciation were added by Masoretic scribes many centuries after the earliest form of the text. That does not mean every word is hopelessly uncertain. Context and tradition resolve most readings. But it does mean that, in some places, the same consonantal skeleton can permit more than one interpretation. The consonants behind orvim can be vocalized differently. Read as orvim, they yield ravens. Read another way. As aravim, they can point toward Arabs, inhabitants of a nearby region, or people associated with a place traditionally identified as Oreb. Under that reading, the passage is not describing trained birds carrying prepared meals. It is describing human beings, local residents, merchants, or sympathizers bringing provisions to a man in hiding. And that changes everything. A fugitive receiving secret food from supporters is not difficult to imagine. It is one of the oldest realities of political resistance. Someone disappears from public view. People who sympathize with him know where he is. They carry bread and meat to the hiding place, while the authorities search elsewhere. The event may still reveal courage, loyalty, and human compassion, but it no longer requires nature to reverse itself. This ambiguity is not a modern internet invention. Medieval Jewish commentators, including the respected Rabbi David Kimhi, known as Radak, discussed the interpretive problem. The possibility has existed within the textual tradition for centuries. But the ancient Greek translation chose ravens, and that choice acquired momentum. Translation became tradition. Tradition became illustration. Illustration became doctrine. Eventually, the inherited image felt more original than the original uncertainty. This is how interpretive inertia works. A decision does not need to be proven again once enough generations inherit it. Repetition gives it the emotional weight of fact. Suppose, however, that the traditional reading is correct. Suppose the story really intends ravens. The problem does not disappear. Leviticus 11 classifies ravens among ritually unclean creatures. The Torah Elijah is portrayed as treats these birds as impure. Yet the narrative asks us to imagine that God selected those same scavengers to handle the prophet's bread and meat twice every day. Where did the cooked food come from? Who prepared it? Why choose carrion-eating birds as sacred delivery agents when the law itself marks them as unclean? One can always produce an explanation. God is free to use an unclean animal. The prophet was in an emergency. The law prohibited eating the bird, not receiving food from it. Apologetic possibilities are almost unlimited because imagination is unlimited. But notice what happens. Instead of the text explaining the event, the reader must keep inventing invisible circumstances to protect the miraculous reading. The simpler possibility remains in front of us. People fed him. Why, then, does the bird version survive so easily? Because miraculous ravens are emotionally stronger than anonymous neighbors. A bird under divine command magnifies the prophet. A human being carrying bread magnifies ordinary solidarity. Religious storytelling usually prefers the image that concentrates authority in the sacred hero. That is worth pausing over. How many beliefs do we hold because they are the most accurate reading, and how many because they create the most memorable picture? How often does spectacle defeat simplicity before evidence is even considered? The next episode presents a different difficulty. It cannot be tested by a single word, and no archaeological excavation can measure the amount of flour in an ancient kitchen. The story says Elijah travels to Zarephath, where he meets a widow gathering sticks. She possesses only a small amount of flour and a little oil. She plans to prepare one final meal for herself and her son, after which she expects them both to die of hunger. Elijah tells her to feed him first. It is an audacious demand, especially when heard without devotional cushioning. Yet he promises that her flour will not be exhausted and her oil will not fail until the drought ends. According to the narrative, the containers continue providing food. I cannot prove that a jar in Zarephath became empty 3,000 years ago. Neither can anyone prove that it did not. A claim placed far beyond observation cannot be defeated by pretending we possess evidence we do not have. But we can examine how such claims function. We can compare their form with older patterns. We can ask whether the story behaves like historical reporting or like a familiar literary motif. And when we do that, the inexhaustible jar enters a very crowded world. Stories of divine abundance appear across ancient cultures. Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions imagined supernatural sources of nourishment. The Greeks had the cornucopia, the horn from which food never ceased to flow. Norse mythology told of Saharimnir, the boar slaughtered and eaten by the gods, only to become whole again and provide another feast. The details differ, but the narrative function is stable. A person or being connected to divine power gains access to food beyond normal scarcity. The inexhaustible vessel is symbolic shorthand. It tells the audience that the sacred figure stands near a source ordinary people cannot reach. The Bible did not emerge outside human culture. Its authors lived among the same fears that shaped other peoples: drought, failed harvests, hunger, sickness, death, invasion. They also used recognizable story forms to answer those fears. To observe this is not to mock ancient people. It is to take their humanity seriously. And the flour and oil story contains an additional political layer. Zarephath lies in Phoenician territory, the homeland associated with Jezebel and Baal worship. By sustaining a widow there, Yahweh demonstrates power in Baal's own territory. The message is sharper than simple generosity. Even in the rival deity's backyard, Yahweh feeds, while Baal remains helpless. The poor woman and her nearly empty jar therefore carry a theological argument much larger than their kitchen. But the deeper literary clue comes from repetition. Elijah's successor, Elisha, later performs a strikingly similar miracle in 2 Kings 4. Another widow faces desperation. Another supply of oil multiplies. She gathers empty vessels, pours, and the flow continues until every container is full. Same structure. New prophet. Expanded result. That duplication leads us toward the method by which authority is transferred in sacred narrative, and toward the child who appears dead in the room upstairs. When a successor repeats the achievement of a predecessor, the repetition does more than create drama. It certifies inheritance. Elisha does not merely follow Elijah chronologically. The stories give him Elijah's narrative credentials. Elijah multiplies food. Elisha multiplies food on a larger scale. Moses divides water. Elijah divides water. Elisha does the same. The new figure becomes legitimate because he performs variations of the signs associated with the old figure. Scholars sometimes describe this as miracle duplication. It is a recognizable literary technique. Authority moves from one character to another through repeated acts. The later miracle does not independently verify the earlier one. Both may belong to a carefully composed pattern designed to tell the audience, the same sacred power continues here. We understand this device easily in other forms of storytelling. A student repeats the gesture of a mentor. A new king wears the old crown. A successor speaks the phrase that belonged to the founder. The repetition tells us who has inherited the role. Yet when the same mechanism appears in Scripture, readers are often taught to regard each episode as a separate historical confirmation. The next Elijah story makes the pattern more emotionally intense. Imagine a child lying motionless. His breathing appears to have stopped. An adult carries him upstairs, lays him on a bed, stretches his own body across the smaller body, places face against face and mouth against mouth, and repeats the action. Then the child begins to breathe. What would you call that physical sequence if you encountered it outside a sacred text? This is the scene in 1 Kings 17. The widow's son becomes ill. His condition worsens until, as the passage describes it, no breath remains in him. Elijah takes the boy, places him on the bed, cries out, and stretches himself over the child 3 times. The boy revives. The theological reading calls this resurrection. But if we temporarily remove the conclusion and look only at the actions, the description resembles an early, desperate attempt at resuscitation. Body contact, pressure, mouth-to-mouth contact, repeated effort. That does not mean Elijah possessed modern medical knowledge. He did not understand oxygen saturation, cardiac rhythm, or brain function. But human beings learned long before scientific medicine that warming, pressing, shaking, breathing into, or repeatedly stimulating an unresponsive person might sometimes produce a response. People act experimentally when someone they love or need appears to be dying. The question is whether the child was irreversibly dead. In the ancient world, there was no stethoscope, no reliable pulse monitor, no imaging, and no clinical standard for brain death. A person who stopped moving, responded to nothing, grew cold, or breathed too faintly to detect could be declared dead. Such judgments were sometimes wrong. Even in much later centuries, when medicine had advanced significantly, there were documented fears and cases of premature burial, people awakening at funerals, in mortuaries, or after being assumed dead. Now move back 3,000 years. A severely ill child's breathing may become shallow enough to escape observation. He may enter a state that witnesses interpret as death. A desperate adult presses against him, warms him, breathes near or into his mouth, repeats the attempt, and the child revives. That is remarkable. It is emotionally overwhelming. It may have felt like a return from death to everyone in the house. But a human misdiagnosis followed by successful resuscitation is not evidence that nature suspended its order. Here, Spinoza's distinction between ignorance and violation becomes essential. Not knowing the cause of an event does not mean the event had no natural cause. A miracle is often the name imagination gives to a causal chain it cannot see. The less the observer understands, the more freedom the story gives to divine intention. Yet the physical possibility is only one layer. The resurrection story also belongs to a competitive mythological environment. Baal's central cycle in the Ugaritic texts revolves around conflict with Maat, the power of death. Baal dies and returns. His relation to death and renewal is central to his identity. In Greek tradition, Asclepius becomes so powerful a healer that he is said to raise the dead, provoking Zeus to strike him with a thunderbolt because such authority threatens the boundary between mortals and gods. Egyptian religion is filled with the death and restoration of Osiris. Ancient Israel was not surrounded by cultures unable to imagine resurrection. It was surrounded by cultures saturated with it. So, the relevant question is not whether the story of Elijah is beautiful or meaningful. It is. The question is why one tradition's resurrection narrative should automatically be called history, while the others are called mythology. What independent evidence distinguishes the boy in Zarephath from Baal, Asclepius, or Osiris? If the answer is simply, my scripture says this one happened, then belief has not been established by evidence. It has been inherited through belonging. Most people do not select their childhood religion after comparing ancient claims under neutral conditions. They receive a map before they know there are other maps. The stories inside that map feel factual. The stories outside it feel legendary. A person born elsewhere inherits the opposite arrangement with equal sincerity. This does not prove every story false. It reveals that confidence often comes from location rather than demonstration. And once again, Elisha repeats Elijah's sign. In 2 Kings 4, the son of a Shunammite woman dies. Elisha enters the room, closes the door, and stretches himself over the boy. The child's body grows warm, and eventually he opens his eyes. The parallel is too close to ignore. The successor receives not only Elijah's food miracle, but also his victory over apparent death. The transfer of authority is now complete. Which of these first 4 episodes unsettles you most? The drought repurposed as theological warfare? The ambiguous vowels that may have transformed human helpers into ravens? The endless food motif repeated across cultures? Or the child whose restoration resembles resuscitation and is then duplicated in the successor's story? There is no required answer. The important thing is to notice what your mind does when the familiar interpretation becomes uncertain. Do you investigate? Do you become angry? Do you rush to protect the inherited conclusion? Or can you remain with uncertainty long enough to understand why the story was constructed as it was? The first 4 episodes weaken under linguistic, historical, medical, and comparative scrutiny. The next 2 require a different kind of examination. They do not merely ask what happened. They force us to ask what kind of violence a miracle is being used to justify. 1 Kings 18 contains the scene that defines Elijah more than any other: the contest on Mount Carmel. The narrative design is brilliant. Elijah confronts 450 prophets of Baal before a gathered population. 2 altars are prepared. 2 sacrifices are placed upon them. No human participant is permitted to light the fire. The deity who answers with flame will be recognized as the true God. The prophets of Baal begin in the morning. They call upon their God for hours. Nothing happens. Their ritual becomes more frantic. They dance, cry out, and cut themselves, but the altar remains cold. Elijah mocks them. Perhaps Baal is occupied. Perhaps he is traveling. Perhaps he is sleeping and must be awakened. One Hebrew expression in the taunt has even been understood as suggesting that the god is relieving himself. The scene is not gentle religious dialogue. It is public humiliation written with sharp comic cruelty. Then Elijah prepares his altar. He orders water poured over the sacrifice again and again until the wood is soaked and the trench surrounding it is filled. He offers a brief prayer. Fire falls. It consumes the animal, the wood, the stones, the dust, and even the water in the trench. The crowd collapses in recognition. Yahweh has answered. Baal has failed. As literature, it is magnificent. The pacing is exact. The rival priests exhaust themselves in a long spectacle and receive silence. Elijah speaks once and receives total cosmic confirmation. Everything in the scene has been arranged to eliminate ambiguity. The soaked altar rules out ordinary fire. The destruction of stone exceeds natural flame. The crowd makes the proof public. The contrast is absolute. But historical claims do not become reliable because their scenes are well written. There is no independent evidence that this event occurred as described. Mount Carmel and the surrounding region have received extensive archaeological attention. Yet no securely identified burn layer, altar remains, or physical trace confirms a fire intense enough to consume stone and vaporize a trench full of water before a national gathering. It is fair to say that absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. Many real events leave little recoverable trace. Private conversations disappear. Small wooden structures decay. Ordinary gatherings dissolve into the earth. But this story is constructed to be neither private nor ordinary. The fire is physically extreme. The audience is enormous. The altar is destroyed. If a claim emphasizes scale in order to establish certainty, the complete absence of physical corroboration matters. We cannot appeal to the event's magnitude when preaching it, and then appeal to its invisibility when asked for evidence. The lack of archaeology is only part of the problem. The political setting explains why such a story would have been useful. Israel is portrayed as divided between Yahweh and Baal. Jezebel, the Phoenician queen married to Ahab, promotes Baal worship. The priestly and prophetic tradition devoted to Yahweh appears to be losing influence. In that context, Mount Carmel functions as a narrative reversal. The losing side receives, on paper, an overwhelming public victory. Baal is defeated in the domain of storm and lightning. His priests are rendered helpless. The entire people acknowledge Yahweh. This reads less like a neutral report than like theological counterpropaganda. Our God defeated yours. In public, on the mountain, under conditions no one could dispute. The story does not merely answer religious doubt. It stages the answer so completely that dissent becomes irrational. Once fire has consumed water and stone before the whole nation, anyone who continues worshiping Baal can be portrayed not as unconvinced, but as rebellious. And that is precisely where the miracle becomes morally dangerous. There is also an internal irony. Elijah constructs an altar on Mount Carmel, yet Deuteronomy 12 insists upon centralized worship and rejects the uncontrolled multiplication of sacrificial sites. Elijah, whose literary role is to defend the covenant against corruption, performs an unauthorized sacrifice away from the prescribed center in order to demonstrate the truth of the law he appears to violate. Defenders may answer that the emergency justified the exception, or that the centralized rule belongs to another stage of Israel's religious development. Historically, that second answer may actually reveal the composition of the texts. Different layers preserve different religious assumptions, but once again, the harmonizing solution is supplied from outside the scene. The contradiction remains visible within the collected tradition. Spinoza urged readers to approach Scripture through the same discipline used for nature. Examine language, authorship, historical circumstance, and purpose. Do not begin by assuming that every passage must agree with every other passage. That assumption forces the reader to manufacture unity where the documents preserve conflict. The Mount Carmel account becomes more intelligible when treated as a human text arising from religious struggle. Its exaggeration serves a purpose. Its perfect contrast serves a purpose. Its public spectacle serves a purpose. The miracle converts political weakness into cosmic victory. But even if we imagine that the fire truly fell, another question would remain. A sign of power does not establish moral goodness. Force is not ethics. The ability to destroy an altar would not, by itself, prove that the victor's commands are just. This distinction is easy to recognize when evaluating other religions or political movements. We do not normally believe that winning a battle proves righteousness, that surviving a disaster confirms ideology, or that displaying power makes every subsequent act moral. Yet inside a sacred narrative, those distinctions often collapse. Power becomes truth. Truth becomes permission. That collapse is what the next verse exploits. The fire has fallen. The people are on the ground. The rival priests have lost. Elijah gives an order. Seize them. Let none escape. They are taken down to the brook Kishon. And there, the miracle becomes a massacre. 1 Kings 18:40 states that the prophets of Baal were seized, taken to the brook Kishon, and killed there. 450 human beings. The passage does not accuse them of murder, theft, or violence against the population. Their defining offense is religious allegiance. They served the defeated God. The fire has supposedly established which deity possesses power, and the narrative treats execution as the proper conclusion. Miracle, verdict, sentence. It is difficult to speak about this calmly, because the scene has often been protected by reverence. But honest reading requires accurate moral language. This is a mass killing of religious rivals. Calling the victims false prophets does not change the physical act. A label supplied by the victorious tradition cannot erase the fact that bodies were taken to a valley and destroyed because they belonged to the other side. Try a simple experiment. Imagine encountering the same story in an unfamiliar sacred book. A prophet stages a supernatural contest. His God apparently answers. The prophet then orders hundreds of followers of the rival religion put to death. Would you call that holy? Would you show it to children as proof of faith? Or would you identify the obvious structure of religious violence? Most people apply moral scrutiny more easily to traditions they did not inherit. Distance creates clarity. Familiarity creates exemptions. The challenge is to judge our own sacred stories by the standards we would apply to anyone else's. If killing people for worshiping the wrong God is wrong when another religion narrates it, the presence of Elijah's name cannot transform the same act into virtue. Either moral principles possess some consistency, or they are only expressions of tribal loyalty. This is where the episode moves beyond a debate about ancient history. The framework is portable. A divine sign establishes exclusive truth. Exclusive truth removes the rival's legitimacy. The rival's illegitimacy makes violence appear sacred. Once accepted, That sequence can be reused by any group convinced that heaven has validated its cause. It has been reused. Crusaders marched with sacred certainty. Inquisitors punished people whose beliefs threatened religious authority. Persecutors across many traditions have interpreted victory, survival, prophecy, or wonder as permission to coerce. The authors of Kings did not personally cause every later atrocity, but the passage preserves a template by which violence can be narrated as obedience. That is why separating the fire from the killing is so effective. Teach the first as a spectacular triumph. Mention the second quickly, if at all. The audience receives the excitement without confronting the moral consequence, but the text does not separate them. The same victory that proves Yahweh's power authorizes the deaths of the defeated priests. And then comes the rain. Remember the beginning. Elijah declared a drought in a land where Baal was worshipped as lord of storm and fertility. The entire contest attacks Baal's supposed control over water. After the fire and after the executions, a small cloud appears. The sky darkens. Wind rises. Heavy rain finally falls. Within the architecture of the story, the water confirms the bloodshed. 3 dry years end only after the religious rivals are eliminated. Nature seems to ratify the execution. The audience is invited to read restored fertility as heaven's approval. This is not a neutral sequence of events. It is moral persuasion. Once we see that, the first miracle and the massacre become one narrative unit. The drought creates the crisis. Carmel supplies the verdict. Kishon removes the opponents. Rain rewards the victory. The entire structure says that the land can become fertile again only when theological impurity has been purged. That idea has consequences. It teaches communities to interpret misfortune as evidence that tolerated outsiders, dissenters, or unbelievers must be removed. Drought, disease, defeat, and social instability can then be blamed on religious difference. The anxious population is offered a target, and violence becomes purification. Spinoza understood the political danger of this mechanism. Fear makes people easy to govern through superstition. When causes are unknown and life feels unstable, human beings search for signs. Authorities then claim the power to interpret those signs. A failed harvest becomes punishment. A military victory becomes approval. A disaster becomes a demand for conformity. People believe they are obeying heaven when they may actually be serving the ambitions of interpreters. Understanding natural causes weakens that power. If drought belongs to climate, it no longer proves divine anger. If rain belongs to atmospheric conditions, it no longer validates a killing. Nature ceases to be a code manipulated by priests and kings. It becomes an order to be investigated. This does not remove moral responsibility, it restores it. We can no longer hide human cruelty behind weather. Ask yourself what would remain of the Mount Carmel story if the fire were removed. 450 religious opponents are seized and killed by the victorious faction. Now ask what the fire contributes. It does not make the deaths less violent. It makes the audience feel that the violence has transcendent authorization. That is the most dangerous function a miracle can perform. The next episode appears trivial after this. No one dies. No altar burns. A man simply runs toward a city, while a king travels by chariot. Yet this smaller story may reveal the production of miracle more clearly than the spectacular scenes do, because the supernatural element rests almost entirely upon a translation. After the rain begins, Ahab rides toward Jezreel. Elijah gathers his garment and goes before him. The distance is roughly 25 to 30 kilometers. Many sermons describe the prophet outrunning horses through divine power, but the Hebrew does not require a race at all. The key word is lifnei, often rendered before or ahead of. The familiar interpretation imagines speed. Ahab leaves in a horse-drawn chariot. Elijah receives supernatural strength, and the prophet reaches Jezreel first. The phrase, "the hand of the Lord was on Elijah," is treated like an ancient description of divine acceleration. God enters the prophet's muscles and turns an ordinary runner into something impossible. It is a vivid image, but lifnei is not a technical word for winning a race. It describes position or precedence, in front of, before, in advance of someone. Elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, messengers are sent lifnei, a leader, to prepare the way, announce an arrival, or perform a public function. No one imagines those messengers competing athletically with the person they precede. Under that ordinary usage, Elijah goes ahead of Ahab as a herald. He precedes the king into Jezreel. In the political culture of the ancient Near East, runners and messengers could travel in advance of a royal arrival. That is a role, not a superpower. The expression about the hand of the Lord does not require supernatural leg strength either. Prophetic literature uses similar language to describe compulsion, urgency, inspiration, or the sense of being seized by a task. Ezekiel and Jeremiah are moved by the divine hand without becoming physically superhuman. The phrase communicates vocation and pressure, not necessarily altered biology. Even if Elijah arrived before the chariot, the weather provides a straightforward possibility. The drought-baked roads have just been struck by heavy rain. Wheels sink, slide, and slow in fresh mud. A person on foot can cut across terrain, choose narrower paths, and avoid places where a vehicle becomes trapped. Horses are powerful, but power does not eliminate the limits of a wheeled vehicle on damaged ground. So what remains? A prophet, driven by urgency, travels in advance of a king over rain-soaked terrain and enters a city as herald. The event is physically demanding, perhaps impressive, but entirely human. The miracle appears only when before becomes faster than, prophetic compulsion becomes muscular enhancement, and narrative proximity supplies spectacle. The episode is placed after heavenly fire and before a fiery chariot. Surrounded by wonders, an ordinary journey is easily absorbed into the miraculous atmosphere. That is how interpretive framing works. We do not evaluate each statement independently. What comes before and after changes what we think we are seeing. Place a natural event between two supernatural claims, and the mind begins to color it with the same expectation. The principle reaches far beyond Scripture. A rumor placed inside a trusted news program feels more credible. An ordinary coincidence inside a story of destiny becomes a sign. An ambiguous sensation during a ritual becomes supernatural confirmation. Context does not merely decorate belief, it helps manufacture it. Translate Lifnei without the assumption of a race, and the divine footspeed vanishes. The prophet is no longer outrunning horses. He is doing the ancient work of a messenger. One word can create a miracle. Repetition can preserve it. Spectacle can prevent anyone from looking too closely. The final episode is different. The earlier stories face external problems, natural explanations, ambiguous language, duplicated motifs, missing archaeology, and moral contradiction. Elijah's ascent faces a problem from within the biblical collection itself. 2 Kings 2 presents the departure with extraordinary visual force. Elijah and Elisha walk together. A chariot of fire and horses of fire separate them. A whirlwind rises, and Elijah is carried upward. Elisha remains below, watching the master disappear, then takes up the fallen mantle. As a final scene, it is nearly perfect. The mentor does not merely die, he becomes unreachable. The disciple receives the mantle, the symbol of succession, while the founder passes beyond ordinary mortality. The image resolves both endings at once. Elijah's authority is exalted, and Elisha's authority begins. But ascent to heaven was not unique to this story. Ancient Mediterranean traditions repeatedly elevated exceptional figures beyond death. Scholars often use the term apotheosis for the literary or religious transformation of a human figure into a divine or semi-divine one. Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome, was said in later accounts to disappear during a storm and become associated with the god Quirinus. Hercules ascends to Olympus after the burning of his mortal body. Traditions surrounding Empedocles imagined an extraordinary disappearance meant to establish immortality. Within Genesis, Enoch does not receive an ordinary death narrative. He walks with God and is taken. These examples are not identical, and some were written later than the Elijah traditions. The point is not that one author mechanically copied another. The point is that ascent was a recognizable way of saying that a revered person exceeded the boundary of ordinary death. Cultures use different images, cloud, fire, mountain, whirlwind, but the narrative function was similar. The figure who ascends becomes difficult to challenge. A dead teacher can be buried, remembered, criticized, and replaced. A teacher taken into the divine realm acquires continuing authority. Absence becomes elevation. The early Hebrew understanding of death makes Elijah's ascent even more extreme. In much of the older biblical worldview, human beings die and descend to Sheol. Heaven is not presented as the routine destination of righteous individuals. Abraham dies. Moses dies. David dies. Even the greatest figures follow the human path. So when a text sends Elijah upward, it is not offering a casual travel detail. It is making the strongest possible statement about status. The prophet has been placed beyond the fate assigned to nearly everyone else. But then another biblical book places Elijah back within ordinary human time, not through a vision, not through a voice from the sky, through a letter. 2 Chronicles 21 tells us that King Jehoram of Judah received a written message from Elijah condemning his conduct and predicting severe consequences. The chronological problem is immediate. In the sequence many readers derive from Kings, Elijah has already departed in the whirlwind before Jehoram's reign in Judah reaches the setting described by Chronicles. Yet here is a physical communication from the prophet to the king, after the chariot, after the horses of fire, after the ascent. A letter. Who wrote it? Who carried it? Where was Elijah when he composed it? Defenders have proposed several solutions. Perhaps Elijah wrote the letter before his departure and ordered that it be delivered later. Perhaps the message was transmitted prophetically. Perhaps the chronology of Kings and Chronicles should be rearranged. Perhaps the Jehoram involved in one reconstruction overlaps the events differently than readers assume. Any of those may be imagined. But the text does not describe Elijah preparing a delayed letter before ascending. It does not say that writing descended from heaven. It does not pause to resolve the tension. The proposed harmonies are scenarios created by later readers who begin with the conclusion that contradiction is impossible. The simpler explanation is that the books preserve different traditions. The chronicler either did not know the ascension story in the form found in Kings, did not understand it literally, or arranged Elijah's activity according to another chronology. Multiple communities transmitted multiple memories, and the editors of the biblical collection did not erase every disagreement. That is not surprising if Scripture is a library created across generations. It is surprising only if we first imagine a single author speaking through every page without historical variation. This is why the letter reaches backward through the entire Elijah cycle. It does not merely complicate one date. It reveals that the texts were not produced as a seamless eyewitness account. Different authors could use Elijah for different purposes. One tradition sends him beyond death in a scene of fire. Another keeps him available to condemn a later king. At least one presentation cannot be literal history in the simplest sense. If the ascent is literary, the chariot, whirlwind, and upward disappearance can still carry meaning. They can symbolize the completion of a vocation, the transfer of authority, the inability of death to erase a prophetic legacy, or the elevation of a founder by later followers. Literature is not the same as worthlessness. A story can reveal human longing, even when it does not report an event. But meaning is not evidence, and symbolism is not biography. The letter quietly removes the protection created by spectacle. Fire draws the eye upward. Paper brings it back to earth. The grandest miracle in the sequence is destabilized not by a modern scientist or a hostile critic, but by another biblical writer. Does that change how you read the story? If one part of Scripture can preserve a tradition inconsistent with another, must every difference be forced into harmony? Or can we allow the texts to be what their history suggests they are? Human documents composed, edited, and transmitted by people with distinct concerns. Now we can see the full pattern. The drought matches the environmental behavior of the region and becomes a polemical attack on Baal, the storm god. The orvim may be ravens, but the consonantal ambiguity allows a reading in which people bring Elijah food. Even the raven interpretation creates tension with the ritual status of those birds. The flour and oil belong to a widespread motif of inexhaustible nourishment, then reappear in enlarged form in the story of Elisha. The widow's son may have been misdiagnosed in a world without reliable measures of death, while Elijah's physical actions resemble resuscitation. The same kind of restoration is repeated by Elisha, and resurrection stories already fill the religious environment surrounding Israel. The fire on Carmel lacks independent physical confirmation and serves the political needs of a Yahweh tradition competing against Baal. The altar itself sits uneasily beside the law of centralized worship. The execution at Kishon exposes the moral price hidden behind the spectacle. 450 people killed for religious difference, followed by rain that narratively rewards the purge. The run to Jezreel depends upon reading Lifnei as athletic superiority rather than precedence and public function. Mud and messaging become supernatural speed. The chariot of fire resembles the ancient elevation of revered figures beyond death, and the later letter in Chronicles reveals an internal collision of traditions. 8 episodes, 8 opportunities to see how a miracle can be formed. Nature interpreted as intention, language fixed by tradition, common motifs attached to sacred heroes, medical uncertainty narrated as resurrection, political propaganda staged as cosmic proof, violence justified by victory, ordinary movement magnified by translation, and literary exaltation mistaken for historical departure. But the most important question is not whether every detail has now been disproved beyond all imaginable defense. Historical reasoning rarely gives us that kind of mathematical finality. The important question is which explanation requires the fewest unsupported assumptions and best accounts for the patterns actually present. Believers can always preserve a miracle by adding invisible possibilities. God left no archaeological trace. God selected unclean birds for a higher purpose. God gave Elijah speed. God arranged a letter in advance. Once unlimited divine action is permitted as an explanation, no evidence can count against the claim. But an explanation that can accommodate every possible outcome explains nothing. If rain proves God and drought also proves God, if evidence confirms the story, and missing evidence confirms the mysteriousness of the story, then the claim has been protected from examination by definition. Spinoza saw this problem centuries before modern biblical criticism acquired its present tools, and he understood that the struggle over miracles was never only about ancient wonders. It was about who possesses the authority to interpret nature and what that authority allows them to demand from everyone else. Baruch Spinoza was born in Amsterdam in 1632 into a Portuguese Jewish family whose history had been shaped by persecution and displacement. He grew up within a disciplined religious community, learned its texts, and encountered the Bible not as an outsider looking for an easy target, but as someone formed by the tradition he would later question. He was still very young when those questions became dangerous. In 1656, at the age of 23, Spinoza was formally expelled from the Amsterdam Portuguese Jewish community. The ban was severe. His name was condemned, his social world was fractured, and the network that had given him identity and belonging was closed against him. 23. It is worth remaining with that age. At 23, many people are only beginning to discover what they believe apart from parents, teachers, and community expectations. Spinoza followed questions that threatened not merely an opinion but his entire place in the world. In 1670, he anonymously published the theological political treatise. Among its most radical arguments was the claim that miracles should not be understood as violations of nature. Nature, in his philosophy, is not a machine occasionally interrupted by an external deity. The order of nature expresses divine necessity itself. To say that God breaks nature would be to imagine God acting against the order that follows from God's own being. For Spinoza, what people call a miracle is an event whose natural cause they do not understand, narrated in a way suited to the imagination and purpose of the audience. Scripture speaks through the concepts available to its authors and hearers. It uses stories, signs, commands, and images to move communities morally and politically. That does not turn biblical writers into modern scientists, nor does it require us to pretend that their descriptions are scientific reports. The Elijah cycle illustrates the argument with almost painful clarity. Weather becomes a duel between deities. Ambiguous consonants become obedient birds. Familiar abundance motifs become proof of prophetic access. An unresponsive child becomes a conquest of death. A religious conflict becomes fire from the sky. A massacre becomes obedience. A herald's journey becomes superhuman speed. A founder's literary elevation becomes transportation into heaven. These are not things nature explains about itself. They are meanings authors place upon events or create through narrative to persuade an audience. Spinoza's position was threatening because miracles support authority. If a priest, prophet, king, or institution can claim exclusive knowledge of supernatural signs, that interpreter gains power over frightened people. The authority does not merely say what happened. It says what the event demands. Obey, conform, punish, sacrifice, remain silent. But if events belong to nature and must be understood through causes, the monopoly weakens. Thunder no longer proves that one faction is favored. Disease no longer proves that a dissenter deserves blame. Victory no longer proves moral purity. A strange event invites investigation rather than submission. Understanding becomes an act of freedom. This does not mean that reason gives human beings total independence from causes. Spinoza did not imagine a will floating outside nature. We are parts of nature, shaped by bodies, histories, desires, fears, education, and circumstances we did not choose. Even the beliefs we call our own have causes. Freedom begins when we understand more of those causes and become less passive before them. Consider what happens when a sacred story produces fear. If you do not understand where the fear came from, it can feel like divine warning. You may obey it automatically, but if you trace it childhood teaching, communal pressure, repeated images, fear of exclusion, the emotion changes. It does not disappear instantly, but it becomes more intelligible. What is understood is less able to rule from the shadows. Perhaps something similar is happening as you listen. If you grew up with Elijah as an unquestionable hero, examining these stories may create an uncomfortable mixture of relief and guilt. Relief, because doubts you carried privately now have language. Guilt, because you were trained to experience the act of questioning as betrayal. Notice that reaction without surrendering to it. A feeling of guilt is not proof that a question is immoral. It may only prove that an authority successfully attached fear to investigation. A belief can defend itself psychologically long after its evidence has weakened. The mind approaches the forbidden conclusion, and the body responds as if danger were near. Spinoza paid a real price for following his reasoning. He lived quietly, supported himself in part through lens work, rejected opportunities that might have compromised his independence, and died in 1677 at the age of 44. His life has often been romanticized into the image of a perfectly isolated sage, but the essential fact remains. Intellectual independence cost him security, community, and ease. You are reading these questions in a different world. No communal official is waiting outside to pronounce a ritual curse because you examined a Hebrew word. No institution should possess the right to punish you merely for asking whether a story is historical, literary, political, or symbolic. That freedom should not be wasted. It is possible to reject one dogma and immediately become trapped inside another. Skepticism can harden into performance. Certainty can return wearing secular clothing. A genuinely Spinozist approach does not replace blind religious belief with blind hostility. It asks us to understand causes, to resist superstition, and to refuse explanations that depend upon fear. That patience is harder than condemnation, but it is also closer to genuine intellectual freedom. That distinction matters because liberation is not achieved merely by reversing the label on everything we inherited. If unquestioning belief says every sacred story must be literal, unquestioning disbelief may say every religious person must be foolish. Both reactions avoid the harder work of understanding. Both reduce complicated human beings to convenient categories. And both can be driven by affects we have not examined. Fear on one side, resentment on the other. To become more active in Spinoza's sense is to ask what is causing our judgment while we judge. Are we following evidence or seeking revenge against an authority that wounded us? Are we investigating the text or using it as a stage on which to perform a new identity? Reason demands more than changing teams. It demands that we become conscious of the emotional forces moving us. This is why the 8 Elijah episodes should not become 8 slogans. Each belongs to a world of drought, royal conflict, religious rivalry, oral memory, translation, editing, and human vulnerability. The natural explanation is not valuable merely because it defeats a supernatural one. It is valuable when it reveals a richer chain of causes. A drought directs us toward climate and survival. The food stories direct us toward scarcity and the narrative hopes of hungry communities. The reviving child directs us toward ancient uncertainty about life and death. Carmel directs us toward political competition and the psychology of public proof. Kishon exposes the frightening speed with which certainty can become permission to kill. The run to Jezreel reveals how language guides imagination. The ascent and the letter reveal how communities preserve different memories of the same revered figure. Seen this way, critical reading does not flatten the Bible. It gives the text back its depth by returning it to history. What disappears is not meaning. What disappears is the demand that meaning depend upon supernatural interruption. The story becomes more human, and therefore more revealing, not a window outside nature, but a mirror of how people live within it. The goal is not mockery. Mockery creates distance, but rarely creates knowledge. The goal is clarity. Clarity means recognizing that ancient authors were human beings, living inside political struggles, inherited myths, linguistic limits, and urgent communal fears. Clarity means refusing to grant our own tradition exemptions we would deny to every other tradition. Clarity means separating beauty from evidence, power from goodness, and emotional familiarity from historical truth. It also means accepting that losing a literal miracle does not necessarily mean losing every value inside a story. The widow's survival can still direct attention toward generosity. The child's revival can still reveal desperation and care. Elijah's mantle can still symbolize the transfer of responsibility. Literature can be profound without becoming a police report from the supernatural. What we lose is the demand to pretend. We no longer have to call drought a divine weapon when climate is enough. We no longer have to turn neighbors into birds because birds make the sermon brighter. We no longer have to excuse slaughter because fire appeared first. We no longer have to invent a delivery system from heaven to protect a chariot from a letter. Instead, we can ask more honest questions. What fears made these stories persuasive? What political conflicts shaped their form? Why did later communities preserve one translation rather than another? Why are triumphs emphasized while victims disappear? And which assumptions in our own lives have become invisible simply because we heard them before we learned how to examine them? The deepest lesson is not that ancient people were foolish. They were not. They used the explanatory tools, symbols, and narratives available to them, just as we do. The deeper lesson is that human beings consistently mistake the limits of their understanding for limits in nature. We convert ignorance into intention. We convert coincidence into judgment. We convert victory into virtue. Then we defend the story, because our identity has become entangled with it. To understand that process is to recover part of the mind's freedom. You have not betrayed truth by examining a claim. Truth does not need protection from an honest question. If a belief survives careful investigation, it becomes clearer. If it collapses, what you lost was not truth, but your dependence on an explanation that could no longer bear scrutiny. So return once more to the letter from Elijah. A few lines of writing in Chronicles stand beside the chariot in Kings. One is quiet, the other is spectacular. One looks ordinary, the other is surrounded by fire. Yet the quiet document may tell us more about how Scripture was formed than the spectacle ever could. Does that letter change the way you read the 7 episodes before it? Does the massacre change the way you judge the fire? Does understanding the possible natural cause diminish the event, or only remove the fear that prevented you from thinking about it? Share the part that affected you most, not as a declaration of loyalty to one camp, but as an honest record of what changed when you looked again. And if you know someone who has carried these questions in silence, send this exploration to them. No one should be punished for following a question to the clearest answer the evidence allows. You did not lose your capacity for wonder by examining these miracles. You recovered the right to decide what wonder means.